So Steve, you're OPA president. You introduce yourself first.
All right, okay, I'll kick it off. I don't have anything prepared, but I can talk off the top of my head reasonably well. So let's see, now we're coming up to 40 participants, looks like now. So that's awesome. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. This is our second OPA, ASA, and actually AFA is taking part in this too. This Q&A opportunity regarding the USDA regulations of birds under the Animal Welfare Act. So we don't have Cody or anybody else from USDA on this call, but David and I have been, working very hard to understand all these regulations. And our goal here is to present to participants some of our concerns, some of the things we've learned, as well as field some questions. So it sounds like we're going to do our question and answers on your Q&A button on your Zoom call. We're going to keep the mics for everybody else muted, otherwise it just gets too noisy with this many participants. So if you want to send us a question or a comment, do it through that Q&A button. And that should be the orientation here for this meeting. So I think, David, you can go ahead and kick it off with what you want to get started with.
Yeah, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm David Garcia, the OPA attorney. So let me just share this PowerPoint. Okay.
There we go.
Okay, so I think, Steve, we obviously start with the thing everybody's most concerned about is the shipping of unweaned birds.
Yep.
So the question is, the question everyone's been asking is, are we going to continue to be allowed to ship unweaned birds? Me and Steve have obviously been in communication with Cody, and we've reviewed the language and we've gotten some response. The letter that PJAC sent out the other day that I'm sure a lot of you saw on Facebook, Cody responded to that, as well as responded directly to Steve, saying that there's going to be some changes made to the language. So the answer of whether we can ship unweaned birds is basically a qualified yes. We have to wait and see what the USDA actually puts out, what they actually say next week. But all the indications we're receiving says that they're going to change the language to permit shipment of unweaned birds if your veterinarian signs basically a health certificate. Basically, they'll give you shipping instructions, and they'll sign those shipping instructions 10 days prior to the shipment, and that will be sufficient for the shipment of unweaned birds. Steve, you wanna?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, this was something that caught us off guard initially, because in the proposed rule, it was clear that shipping of unweaned birds is going to be allowed, just had to be part of your veterinary care plan. But when the final rule was published just a couple of weeks ago, the language essentially said the only way you can ship unweaned birds is for veterinary purposes. And that did not match, of course, the proposed rule. It also didn't match the stated intent in the preamble. So there's, a lot of language before you get to the actual regulations. And in that language, which is, explaining USDA's decision, they were explaining that they were allowing shipping of unweaned birds with a veterinary signature on the instructions for their care in transit. So that raised a whole bunch of red flags, because the language in the regulations are the important part. That's what inspectors and airlines and everybody else has to go by. And it was very clear the way it was written that standard shipments of unweaned birds would not be allowed. So we talked to Cody about that, and he realized what was going on as well. And so, as is always the case with government regulations, they've got to run it through their channels to come up with the official language that then matches their intent. So yes, that is the case, and there is a small hurdle that any shipper will have to go through. But the official language should be released next week, but essentially we expect it to state that a shipper or breeder who's shipping unwinged birds to his customer is going to have care instructions signed by their vet. So it's basically the same type of thing as a health certificate that we often have to get anyways.
Yeah, and so Steve, you said something important there that we probably should have addressed at the beginning. For those of you who have read that document, that's 200 and something odd pages. Those first 230 pages of that document, the bulk of it is just them responding to everybody's comments. And nothing in that first section is binding. It's not regulation. So yes, it does provide some explanation, so we understand where the regulations are coming from. And yes, it is useful as something to have in the future in case they decide to change how they apply the regulations. But really, the only thing that matters is the end of it, where they put the text of the regulations in place. And so, to sum up, it seems like they're going to fix the problematic text that they gave us, but we have to see next week what they do, how they do it, and hopefully that it sticks. Because obviously, that's the other point that we haven't talked about, is that this litigation is still ongoing. The lawsuit is stayed, which is basically put on a temporary hold until April 7th for the animal rights groups that sued the USDA to decide if they're happy or if they want to do something else. So that's the summary of this. Is basically, it seems like we're gonna get a small win on this, but we have to wait and see. So moving on to the other thing that was the big surprise was the definition of what is a pet animal, which is something they sort of threw at us that was new. Originally, it wasn't something we thought about, because they had originally said that birds were pet animals, parrots were pet animals, so it wasn't really something of importance. But now they've taken a step back and saying, well, okay, not all birds and not all parrots are pet animals. And they're going through this process of putting some birds on the pet animal list and some birds not on the pet animal list. I have up there, you can see what is currently on the pet animal list. It includes finches, a lot of parrots, doves, poultry, kookaburras, turacos, toucans, hornbills. Those are all basically what are pet birds right now. There's some notable exceptions on here. I mean, I personally think the hawk-head parrot should be on here. It doesn't fall in. I don't think it falls into any of those broad common name categories that they have. And I'm sure there's others. Why is this important? Well, we'll see when we're going forward. Basically, the exemptions, the de minimis exemption, the retail pet store exemption, relate back to whether you have pet animals or non-pet animals. And so, as of right now, this is the pet animal list. We got quite a few things added on it this week, just through having people email Cody of what should be on it. I think we do need to take another look at it and hopefully get some more things on it if possible. Email him again, and hopefully we can get a couple more things added to the list before it calcifies. But you'll see why this is important as we move on through the exemptions.
Yeah, and I want to explain also how this works within the Animal Welfare Act as it has been applied to mammals for many years. So this is just a point of understanding. So for example, with mammals that have been regulated by the Animal Welfare Act for decades, there are two essential classifications of mammals. There's pet animals, and then there's exotics. And to use the common examples that I always use, things like rabbits, hamsters, guinea pigs are pet animals. But something like a hedgehog or a sugar glider is considered an exotic. Yes, sugar gliders and hedgehogs are kept as pets, but they're not in the same category as a hamster or a guinea pig, etc. And that's what USDA is essentially trying to accomplish here with this list. I'll point out that this list is far more extensive than the list for mammals. So that's a good thing, but there are a lot of birds, as David mentioned. Hawkhead parrots is one that doesn't fit any of those categories, and they're probably mostly kept as pets. Obviously, there's people who breed and raise them as well, but they fit with the same categories as a lot of the other birds that are already on that list. Mini macaws, kites, et cetera, they're commonly kept as pets. And so hawkhead, as an example, probably should be on that pet animal list as well. This list is going to be a work in progress, I think, for a while. And I think the important thing here is also, our tendency is to want things to be very clear, which in this case would require a species by species list that would be, much, much larger. And I think USDA's goal here is to have some flexibility, to not pin everything down with an exhaustive list, but rather to provide general categories. So that's why it reads the way it does. USDA does want to keep that flexibility, and I think that benefits both sides of this, USDA as well as us.
Yeah, and there are quite a few. There are other things on this list that have concerned me, Steve, and I think I mentioned this to you. For example, Poicephalus is listed under small, but there's Poicephalus species that are over the small weight, over the 250-gram line, and those are also things that I pointed out to Cody. We're hoping that they clarify this and add quite a few more things. This is one of those things that's going to require, continual effort on our part to inform them of what are pet birds, and this is one that will be very susceptible to like mass mailing, getting emailing him directly and saying, I have this as a pet, why is it on the pet list?
Right. Right.
Yeah. So moving on to the big question, who's regulated? And if you ask me, Steve might have a different answer, but my short answer is everyone except pet owners. The regulations cover breeders of parrots, hookbills, softbills, pheasants, raptors, and poultry if you're not raising it for food or fiber. So basically, if you raise any type of bird for a pet purpose, and that includes, and pet purpose here includes like fancy or showing, fanciers or showing. So people who raise like fancy poultry technically fall under the licensing requirements and will need to be licensed. Now there are exemptions that we'll go forward as we go forward. We'll talk about it, but as of right now, it's pretty much everyone who breeds a bird for a pet purpose will need a license, as long as but not pet owners.
Exactly, and that's USDA is regulating commerce, essentially, the trade, as an exhibition, which we'll do a whole separate thing on in the future. But just so everybody's clear, that's not the bird shows. Exhibitions like a zoo, they charge people money to come in to see the animals. So that's where the commerce part comes in. But yeah, the short answer is essentially anybody who raises and sells or sells birds, unless they qualify for one of the exemptions, which we're going to get to in a moment. But basically, birds are regulated under the Animal Welfare Act now. So any activity of keeping birds, except pet owners, because that's not in commerce. You own your pets in your home. You're not selling it or reselling it or anything else. And yes, if you have a pet bird and you need to sell it because you can't keep it anymore, you're fine. You're going to be under the de minimis levels, which we'll get to in a moment.
Yeah. And I guess the last point, Paul, Steve, we should bring up is they did alter the definition of bird So a bird now becomes a bird when it starts hatching. So I don't know if we have any raptor people on here, but if your bird becomes a bird, your chicken becomes a bird the minute it peeps. And so that'll bring it under humane requirements of the Animal Welfare Act. So so Steve, I thought we'd start with the retail pet exemption.
Okay,
The retail pet exemption, to give everyone a quick overview, is basically saying if you sell on a face-to-face transaction. So imagine your house has a porch, and you go on the porch with your parrot, with your conure, and someone walks up to your porch and says, "I want to buy it," and they give you a check and you hand them the bird. That's a retail pet transaction. And if you do that, you are exempt from the USDA. And if you do all your sales like that, you are exempt from the USDA. So this means, and the idea is that this covers both your traditional pet store, the brick and mortar store that you go into, but it also covers people who sell out of their home, and don't have, a business that ships. And so there's the first distinction. If you ship birds, you will not meet the retail pet store exemption. The other thing is, and I highlighted them here, we have 3 exclusions to the exemption. So if you meet one of these exclusions, you are also not a retail pet store for the purposes of this rule. One of them is any store or person who sells or offers to sell a non-pet species of warm-blooded animal. So for anyone who doesn't know, birds are warm-blooded animals. And so going back to the previous slide where we were talking about the pet animals, what are pet animals? Here, if you're selling any bird that's a non-pet species of warm-blooded animal, you don't meet the retail pet exemption. You need a license. So hawkheads are not currently on the pet list. So if you're selling hawkheads, you are not a retail pet store because it's a non-pet species. Likewise, any person or store that sells warm-blooded animals, again birds, for exhibition purposes. So if you breed, certain species, and your clientele is zoos, and you're selling to zoos, you're not breeding for you're not a retail pet. You don't have a retail pet exemption because you're selling them for exhibition purposes. And lastly, or the last one that's important, is any establishment wholesaling any animals. And so this is if you're like Steve, who has a big operation, he can't just say, well, I'm a retail pet store because my distributor drives up the driveway and I give him 1,000 conures for a wholesale price. So those are the 3 big exclusions to the retail pet store exemption.
yeah, this is where, again, it gets a little bit confusing, right? Because I like your example you gave the other day, tanagers. They're not on that list. That's a small bird. But essentially it's not on that pet bird list. So anytime you're selling those, you're going to have to be licensed. That's why that pet bird versus exotic bird list is so important. In addition to the fact that brick and mortar retail stores, obviously they would rather be exempt from USDA licensing. And the idea there is, the reason there is that exemption is twofold. A retail pet store, the consumer comes in, sees the facility firsthand that they're buying their animal from. And the second part of that is that typically retail pet stores, brick and mortar stores, are subject to local animal control licensing and inspections. So that also helps remove them from USDA licensing. But the caveat is that they only sell pet animals. So in other words, now tanagers, they're not on the list. If a pet store wants to sell tanagers, they're going to have to be USDA licensed. Likewise, if a pet store sells, thousands of budgies a year with customers coming in and buying them, that's perfectly fine. But once they hit the de minimis level, which I think we're probably going to talk about on the next slide, I'm guessing, there's a level of 200 small birds or 8 large birds. So you can sell all you want, retail, face-to-face transaction, but as soon as you start shipping these things, birds, you're going to be subject to the de minimis levels set, even as a retail pet store. Those transactions that don't happen face-to-face, once they add up to the de minimis exemption, you will have to be licensed regardless of what type of bird it is.
Yeah, and so on that note, the de minimis exemption.
There it is.
Yeah, the de minimis exemption is one of the bigger changes from the proposed rules to the new rules, to the new regulations. I definitely consider it to be unexpected. And it is problematic, and I'm sure we'll talk about why it's problematic, but this is one of those don't look a gift horse in the mouth kind of situations. So the de minimis exemption, and this is, as Steve was saying, this is either or. So if you fall into one, you can also fall into the other. So if you sell 200 or fewer birds under 250 grams, and so a 250 gram bird is a parakeet, a sun conure, and some of the smaller kikes and some of the smaller pioneers, even some of the smaller Amazons fall into that category. If you sell less than 200 of those, then you don't need a license. And or, so you can sell 200 birds of 250 grams or less, and you can sell 8 birds greater than 250 grams and not need a license. Or you could sell 8 birds that are over 250 grams and not need a license. But if you sell that 201th small bird or that 9th large bird, you are no longer in this exemption and you need a license. And to address a couple points that people have asked me directly, the weight is determined by the average adult weight of the species. Where they are getting it from, I'm not 100% sure, but when this started, I sent them a copy of Tony's book. I'm sure at some point they consulted Parents of the World, and all these books have weights. And so I'm sure they're consulting some agricultural manual that they got their hands on for the weights. So far, nothing they put on the big or small side of that list seems weird to me. So I think they have a general idea. Again, they haven't addressed the idea of, white-fronted Amazons are under 250 grams. Cape parrots are over 250 grams. So they haven't addressed that, but obviously they seem to have a general idea of what the average adult weight of these species are. And the other point that I think is important to the de minimis exemption is it has to be birds which were raised on his or her premises for pets or exhibition. So if you're a broker, if you're someone who buys from me or Steve to then resell, you won't fall into the de minimis exemption because they weren't born on your premises. They have to be born on your premises, on the licensed facility. So this is an exemption for the individual breeder, not for the other steps in the commercial sale of birds. And the last point is that I want to make before I give it off to Steve is it doesn't apply. It's 200 birds per household, per facility. Like if you're an individual who has, your facility is your house, you can't say, well, I sell 200 and then my wife sells 200, so we get to 400. It's per facility. That's one facility. Your household is one facility. It's 200 birds for the facility. Even if you can demonstrate, well, no, when I met my wife, I brought 100 birds. I brought 100 pairs to the marriage, and my wife brought 100 pairs to the marriage. It's not gonna. There's no getting around it. It's 200 per facility.
Yeah, I actually don't have anything to add to that. That pretty much covers it. So,
okay. Yeah. And obviously, I know lots of people have also complained to me about, 200 small, 8 large. That makes no sense. And I think we can all agree it doesn't make any sense. I haven't gotten any sense that they're gonna budge on it. I don't know if you have, Steve. But again, I'm of the opinion this is a gift horse, don't look it in the mouth. And you know, we're just gonna have to live with the illogical nature of it.
Okay,
Yeah.
yep,
So next, inspections. So basically, everyone who's going to be licensed will need an inspection. There's no getting around that one either. And you need to have your facility basically open to inspection. That's one of the requirements. But there's 2 points here. One, you need to be available for inspection, including all your records and everything during business hours. So it's a good idea to establish business hours. And at other times mutually agreeable to the applicant. So that's one of those things that when you apply for your license, you can say, you know, I'm available. I will always be available Fridays after 3 o'clock. And so, yes, they will still come and randomly inspect you. You never know what Friday at 3 o'clock they will inspect you, but you will be able to weed down the world of possible times that they could come visit you, from any time to business hours and mutually agreed times. Steve, anything else?
yeah, it's definitely, I think that was a suggestion actually that we got. It's got to be something reasonable, right? You can't say, you know, 1 hour on Tuesday afternoon after it rains on the prior Thursday, or, you know, something like that.
Yeah.
That's not going to fly.
It can't be a parking sign.
Yeah, right. So you want to have a window. I mean, if you can leave 2 or 3 days a week, it's best to state that, so that you're at least limiting it to what is most convenient for you. And it does narrow that time. If you have a job outside, away from your facility, it narrows that time of concern for you. So that's definitely recommended, yeah.
So next, veterinary care. I know this is another one that people have had a lot of concerns about. Nothing really changed between the proposed rules and the final rules, so we're just going to rehash this real quick. Everyone needs an attending veterinarian, and that veterinarian basically needs to come periodically to the facility. Periodic means once a year at a minimum. And you're going to have to develop with your vet a written plan of veterinary care. The USDA is basically going to give us a form that you have to check off with your vet and fill out the boxes. My understanding is that it isn't up yet, and they don't have it ready yet, but that it will come up soon. And basically, your biggest hurdle here is going to getting a vet that you like, that won't give you too much of a headache. But we're not going to go into I'm not going to go into the details of what needs to be in the veterinary care plan, because basically this is going to be a form that you have to check some boxes and write some things, and that will meet it once the USDA puts out the actual form that everybody has to do.
Yeah, so again, it's important to understand. I've had a lot of people ask me questions about this, and some people get confused because there's going to be a USDA inspector, and those USDA inspectors are often veterinarians. They're coming to inspect your facility to make sure you're in compliance. That's a separate inspection from what this is referring to. This is your own veterinarian that you work with to help you manage your facility and your protocols and everything else, to make sure your birds and the rest of your animals are well cared for. So this is your own veterinarian. That's your attending veterinarian. So that veterinarian, your attending veterinarian, should be on site at least once a year. If you don't have a vet coming physically to your facility once a year, the USDA isn't going to be real happy with that. And that's a potential problem that you'll have to remedy. So again, when USDA sends an inspector, happens to be a vet, that doesn't cover you for your annual inspection from your own attending veterinarian.
So moving on, identification. This is one that I'm particularly fond of. So you're gonna have to, the rule is gonna require that any licensee identify their birds and keep records as to purchase, sale, acquisition, or disposal of said birds. So that's two things. One, you need to identify what birds you have, and then any birds that you buy, sell, or euthanize, basically, you need to keep record of that. So how do we identify them? They give you three options for identifying your birds. One is a label attached to the cage, the primary enclosure where the birds are actually held, that says the number of the birds, the species, any distinctive physical features, and any identifying marks on the bird. So let's give an example. You have a cage full of green cheeks. There's 3 green cheeks in the cage. You write 3 green cheeks, species Pyrrhura mullinae, and then distinctive features, none, and or 1 blue, 1 pied, 1 sun cheek, whatever you want. And then identifying marks, none. So in theory, your label will say 3 Pyrrhura mullinae, none, and that'll be your label. That's one way of meeting this. Version 2 is a leg band or wing band on every bird, and it has to be an individually identifying ring band. So it has to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, not all the leg bands just can't say ABC birds or whatever. This is my personal preference. I think this is the easiest way. It helps you keep track of your own birds, and it's simpler. You don't have to be updating tags, but to each his own. But if every bird in your facility is leg banded, you meet the requirement. And then the last version way of meeting this is a microchip. And if you have your birds microchipped, you have to keep a reader on property. So if they want to verify that your birds are microchipped, they can scan a bird and check it. But that's basically it. You have to do one of those 3 things to all of your birds to identify them. And we'll come back to the record keeping requirement, but next we'll jump to the contingency plan. I know this is a lot of words on a screen. It's scarier than it looks. If you are a Florida licensee, you already have a contingency plan that'll probably meet all of these requirements. Basically, you need to have a plan. You need to say what disasters am I reasonably likely to maybe encounter. So if you live in Florida, a hurricane, an electrical outage, and I don't know what other disasters we have in Florida. That's it. If you're in California, wildfire, earthquake. If you're in Oklahoma, tornado. So you basically have to say these are my emergencies that I'm likely to have, and then you have to outline what you would do in that situation. So and who's going to do it. So if there's a wildfire, employee X will begin catching birds, employee B will put them in a fireproof building or something like that. And you also need to identify like issues such as animal escapes or mechanical breakdown. So if you have if your water pump breaks, what are you going to do when a water pump breaks and stuff like that. But it's relatively simple. You just have to identify the possible emergency and what you'll do in that situation. Steve, any thoughts?
That's pretty straightforward. This is part of USDA's licensing, for mammals at this point already.
Yeah.
So yeah, we have to comply with the same thing that existing licensees have to comply with. The contingency plan, of course, with all the disasters we've had in, the past few years, that's become a big deal, and that is now part of the regulations. So, follow the guidelines on that, develop the plan that's appropriate for you. But there's pretty specific guidelines there that you need to follow and comply with. That is one of the things that the USDA inspector is going to be looking at, that you have this plan in place.
Yeah, and this and everything else that the USDA requires you, it's always better to skew vague and non-committal than it is to give a very detailed plan. So it's better to say, we will respond appropriately in such situation than say we will respond A, B, C, D, E, and F every single time in every situation, because they're going to also check that you follow these plans. And so you're better off saying, well, giving yourself leeway to deviate from any plan. And this applies to everything the USDA is gonna make you do. So the next one, Steve, I didn't talk to you about this one, but I know this is one that scares people, so I put it on here. Confiscations. I know people have asked me, in what situation will the USDA confiscate my animals? These confiscation rules are relatively lenient. If they come to your property, or someone tells them, if an animal rights activist says, oh, I know that person, he's abusing birds, and they come out and they see something that they think is a problem, they give you a chance to fix it before they confiscate. And they only confiscate if they get basically a confirmation from a higher up that it is a problem. Confiscations from the USDA are relatively rare, and you basically have to really want them to confiscate your animals. They're not the situation where they're just going to walk onto the property and say, someone told us you're mean to the birds and we're taking everything. That's not their MO. So yes, there always is the possibility that the USDA would confiscate animals if they're in a bad situation, but it's not a one strike and you're out. Basically, they give you opportunities to fix it. There's review, and it's only after you refuse to do anything and someone above the inspector says, okay, take the animals, that you would ever be in a situation where the USDA is confiscating.
Yeah, during any inspection, anything that an inspector finds that's not in compliance, you're given the opportunity to fix it. And simple things like that, I often use the example of expiration dates on medication or disinfectants or even feed if it has an expiration date on it. You're not allowed to have those. So you're in non-compliance. But that's a very simple thing to fix, right? So the inspector comes up and he looks at your medication you might have on hand and it's expired. You say, sorry, Mr. Inspector, let me dump that out now. And you simply get a note on your inspection report that it was resolved during the inspection. It's no longer, you're not any longer in violation of the language. So you have that opportunity. It's something really simple like that. More significant non-compliance issues, the inspector will generally reschedule in a week or 2 weeks or whatever time frame they use. They'll allow you the opportunity to fix it, come into compliance, they come back out, verify that the repairs have been done, and you're good to go. Again, if they do this over and over, that they give you that chance to repair something that's significant and you don't repair it, you've really kind of left them no option but to now start giving you fines, license revocations, things like that. It's pretty serious, but it's kind of on you. If you didn't do what you were supposed to do and said you would do within that time frame, you're kind of leaving them no recourse other than to start escalating the issue. So yeah, it doesn't go straight to confiscations and things like that. You have many options. Well, maybe not many, but you have several options to come into compliance before it ever gets to that point.
Yeah, and to be clear, confiscations require that the animal to be suffering. So, they might revoke your license because you refuse to label the bleach bottle, but they're not going to confiscate your animals because you refuse to label the bleach bottle. Also, Steve, minor correction. The previous version of the rules said you couldn't have feed past the expiration date, but they actually got rid of that. So now you can have your feed past the expiration date. It's just the meds you can't have past the expiration date.
Excellent.
So record keeping. There's a record keeping provision for brokers, and there's a record keeping provision for dealers. I'm assuming most everyone on the call, I know some people on here might be brokers, but since most of you are breeders, we're only going to deal with the breeder provision today. And basically on the screen, you see the 7 requirements for record keeping for breeders. This is going to be a weird transition because I know a lot of people who buy birds and breed birds are, how do I put it nicely, like their privacy. But unfortunately, going forward, if you are USDA licensed, you need to keep a record of whoever you sell or buy birds from, and you're going to need to, if they are licensed, you will need to take their license. However, if you are selling or buying to someone who isn't licensed for whatever reason, they're exempt, you're selling to a pet owner, whatever, you're going to need the vehicle license number and the state and the driver's license of the person if they are not licensed, if they are not a USDA licensee, which is going to, I know it's going to be a weird transition to basically say, I need to take a copy of your license, of your driver's license, and write down your license plate to sell you this bird. But that is what's going to be required in your logbook, to say, I sold to Joe Schmo, unlicensed, and he was driving a Florida car with this tag, and his driver's license number was XYZ12345. And then on top of that, you're going to need to get his name and the name of the address, and then document the date and the date of the transaction, the species, and the number of animals in the transaction. So that part's reasonable, it makes sense, but you will have to start taking driver's licenses, basically.
Yeah, and it's important, to be clear that this is for essentially wholesale transactions or non-face-to-face transactions that would otherwise be exempt. And again, all of this sort of interplays. This is why the pet bird list versus exotic bird list is important, because remember, the pet birds are the ones that have that de minimis level. A bird that's not on that, even if you're selling it as a retail or to an end consumer, that's a licensable transaction, and all of this would then apply. So again, that's why it's important that we get as broad as possible on those pet bird classifications.
So next, facilities. If you've been on the previous Q&A, this basically remains the same. Your facility needs to be constructed so it's structurally sound for the birds in them. It needs to be in good repair, protect the birds from injury. The main change here is that it says, it used to say you have to restrict animals from entering. It now says restrict other animals from entering that may negatively affect the welfare of the birds within. What does that mean? Your cages need to be built so you don't get rats in there, so that the raccoons don't pull the legs off your birds, that kind of situation. And then you must employ, and then here's the other point that people have a concern: you must employ security measures that contain all birds securely. And they give you a list here that basically seems to say double doors, but it ends with other equivalent systems designed to prevent escapes of birds. So I'm still not happy with this. I don't like that they kept these examples, but from everything they've told us, they're willing to accept systems other than double enclosure. So you just need to, when your inspector comes, you need to be prepared to say, my system to prevent escapes is, my feed hatches are spring locked. My doors are all hog rigged. My nest boxes are wrapped. When I pull birds, I have a second with me, and stuff like that. You need to be ready to give them a list of things you do that prevent escapes. And then finally, your place needs to be basically clean, free of clutter, no trash, no waste, no junk. So, if you have a lot of junk laying around, dispose of it before the USDA comes, because in theory, you're not allowed to have, a lot of trash hanging about.
Yeah, and I'm gonna say it here. I say this to Cody all the time when we talk. He's heard me tell him this multiple times. I wish we didn't have to have regulations. I would love this whole thing to go away. But that's not what's going to happen. We have to be regulated based upon a court decision that is forcing USDA to do this. So since we have to do this, we better do it right. And the point of the Animal Welfare Act is essentially to improve the care and husbandry of the animals that are under its purview. So now that birds are under that, that's what USDA is going to be doing. And honestly, keeping your facility clean and uncluttered is really critical, as I'm sure all of you know that have had birds, especially outside for any length of time, is pest control. You've got to keep your facility clean just to keep pests under control. And if you don't do that, you're going to have problems. So, this sort of requirement, sure, we like to throw our old nest boxes in the corner. We'll deal with them later. We all do that. But that sort of thing we're going to have to be mindful of. We're going to have to step up and keep our facilities cleaner than we otherwise would when we're the only ones there, because now USDA is going to be knocking here and there. Again, they're not the enemy. They're here to improve the conditions where they need improvement. And that's certainly one of them. I think we've all been to different bird breeders and, they've seen them. I have piles of stuff in different areas of my place that I know I'm going to have to get rid of. We're all like that. But that's an improvement. So I think this is a pretty reasonable requirement.
So cages, there's going to be a couple of these, but let's start with the basics. Your cage has to be non-toxic to the bird. I know there's a whole debate about whether galvanized cages are toxic to the bird, but industry standard is galvanized cages, so I wouldn't worry about that. Free of rust or damage that affects structural integrity or prevents cleaning. So you can have a rusty cage, but if it's falling apart, it's no good. There's levels of rust here, and surface rust, okay. Rust that, the cage is falling apart, bad, not going to work. And then the cage has to be free of jagged edges or sharp points that could injure the bird. That's also relatively reasonable. And Steve, I'm just going to move on to the next one because these are all common sense ones.
Yep.
And then, so here are some more continuing things. So, restricts other animals from entering the cage. We already talked about that. It just has to be other animals that, could injure the bird. So no rats. The birds need to have an option to stay dry and clean and also in the shade. So if you have a holding cage and it has 20 birds in it, you have to make sure that all the birds can get under the shade and stay dry and clean. If it's one of those situations where there's one bird that's always on the other end and always getting wet and in the sun, that's not going to work. You have to solve that. The cages have to provide easy access to food and water, and the surfaces need to be able to be cleaned. And then one that people have asked me about is the floors. There's a rule that says they can't sag, but they can't sag to the point that would cause injury. So just because you have a cage that's bowed out like this does not mean it's in violation. But if you have it to the point where it's like this, that's a violation. It's only if the sagging is to the point that it would injure the bird in the cage. Likewise, this is one that I brought up a couple times, battery cages. So they haven't changed the rule. It still says that cages have to be suitably screened from each other to prevent injury between birds in one cage and the other. They did clarify that they are fine with mesh. You can have a battery cage that has mesh walls, so long as there's no injury or aggression happening between the birds in those cages. So if you can breed green cheeks with a common wall and not have any toes nipped off, not have any problems, then your battery cages are fine. But obviously, you know, if you have a battery cage for macaws and they're taking the tip of their beaks off fighting through the wire, you know, that's not going to be okay. And I'm sorry, Steve, that's all the stuff on cages. You have any other?
Well, actually on the previous slide, but you don't have to go back to it. The section about providing potable water and food, you know, it's common sense stuff. But some birds shouldn't have food available to them all the time. Raptors, things like that. Some birds you want on somewhat of a fasting period and then offering them food for a limited time during the day. So that would seem to be in conflict with that requirement, but as long as you put that in your veterinary care plan, that's the routine you have to maintain these birds properly, then it's fine. So that's part of the flexibility that I kind of mentioned earlier. You know, don't look at, let me rephrase that. We do need to look at this very critically and pick it apart. That's again, like I tell David all the time, I'm really happy he's involved here because he's a very critical reader and looks at all the possible ways that these things could, you know, come back to bite us. But at the same time, understand that there is flexibility. So language like that, definitely question it, but find out if there are ways that your management plan can continue with those exceptions. And usually it's the veterinary care plan. As long as you document it there, you're good to go.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Steve. For example, the watering requirements, which we're going to go back to in a little bit, but basically says you have to give them water, you know, regularly available. But if you, for example, I had to deworm my birds recently and I restricted their water so that I could then give them medicated water. To do that, you just have to have it, you know, vet in your veterinary care plan, you know, vet approved, basically saying so.
Right.
So, you know, I'm going to leave them half a day without water so that when I give them medicated water, they go drink it right away and drink the correct dose. That you can do those things that deviate from the plain language of this, so long as it is, you know, part of the veterinary care plan.
Right.
So food storage. So basically, this one changed a little bit, not too much, but it did change a little bit. Basically, your food needs to be stored in a way that prevents it deterioration, spoilage, contamination, and vermin infestation. That's basically common sense. The original version of the rule said that you had to keep it in bins, sealed. They walked back from that a little bit. They basically said, we're going to accept that you can fold over bags and put clips and things like that. But you still have to basically store your food sealed at a minimum. So, you know, the ideal situation probably will be getting garbage cans and putting your open bag in the garbage can and putting the lid on after you're done feeding. But they walk back that strict requirement, and the same goes for bedding. They had originally said that you need to keep your bedding in like a trash can, and they walk that back. It just needs to be stored to prevent deterioration and spoilage and contamination. Your supplies must be stored off the floor and away from the walls, which is a bit tedious and takes up more space than it should. But this one they didn't budge on, and they refused to budge on. So personally, what I'm going to do in my situation is I'm getting some some rollers, some basically like carts without handles, and I'm putting my food on the carts. And when the inspectors come, I'm going to roll it away from the walls, and then when they leave, I'm going to roll it right back to where it goes. And then your food must be stored in a manner that prevents the deterioration of its nutrient value. What that means, I'm not really sure. Steve, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that one, but that's basically what it says.
Yeah, again, most of this is common sense type stuff.
Yeah.
My feed, for example, which I have lots of it, I always store it on a pallet. So it's up off the floor, it's sitting on a pallet. I do push my pallets against the wall, but they're on a pallet and I have a pallet jack. I pull them out, I clean behind it. And my understanding, even though if I'm not allowed to store it against the wall, but the fact that I can move it out and clean is fine. That's in compliance. So it's that sort of common sense. Deterioration and spoilage, again, common sense. If you're leaving your feed out in the sun, out in the rain, that's going to deteriorate or spoil the feed. Keep it cool and dry, and we all try to do that. Don't leave it sitting around where you're going to have a bunch of, your bird cage trays coming near it and scraping into a trash can right next to an open bag of feed, right? Common sense type stuff. I really can't add any more than that. We are going to have to step up our game, but I think these are reasonable things to achieve.
Yeah, and on that point, I mean, I would also say, like, we've all had the bag of feed that gets what's it called? I forget what it's called in English, Steve. The little moth that gets
the Indian seed moths, yeah.
Yeah, that's one of those things. We've all had it. We've all had a bag. We probably all fed a little bit of that because it's just a little bit. But it's one of those things. You're not gonna be able to have if you go in your feed room and they see grain moths everywhere, you're gonna have a problem. So little things like Steve says, you got to step up your game and reduce the possibility of those things to as much as possible. So I put this one together: cleaning supplies and dead animals. Substances such as cleaning supplies and disinfectants, which are harmful to the birds, must not be stored in the food storage or preparation area. This is what I complained about because the way I read it, this basically says you can't have your soap on your kitchen counter, but they seem to not read it that way. I don't really know how they avoid that, but so basically you can't, whatever is your kitchen surface, you can't have the bottle of bleach there. You can't have, whatever other disinfectant, you can't have it there. You can store it in other areas. So you can store it where you have the animals in cabinets, or you can just store it away from the food preparation area. And again, and another thing is, if you take a bottle of bleach, for example, and you pour it into a spray bottle, you need to write on the spray bottle bleach. You can't have unlabeled cleaning products. So the easy solution to this is just keep your cleaning products in the jugs which they come in. But if you do put bleach into a spray bottle, you have to label it, that kind of thing. And then animal waste and dead animals. This one I just want to highlight because I know people tend to keep their dead birds sometimes for whatever purpose. You can't keep, you can't put, if your bird dies, you can't put them in a bag in the freezer where you keep the vegetables. You're gonna have to put them somewhere else. Personally, if you're not going to necropsy the bird, within an hour or two of it dying, I'm of the opinion you just throw it away. But if you want to keep it for whatever reason, to send it to be taxidermy, whatever it is, you have to store it in your home fridge, not the animal fridge.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? I don't think it's a violation if you store the dead bird next to your food. You just can't store it next to the bird's food.
Yeah.
Which is, kind of funny when you think about it. But again, it's common sense. Let's see, I had a thought on this. And what was it? I lost track. So things like cleaning supplies, not be stored in food storage and preparation areas. This is kind of one of those practical matters and flexibility issues too. I understand what the language says. What I have been told by current licensees for mammals is if you have a food prep area, like a kitchen counter that you're doing food prep on, don't store any harmful chemicals, cleaning chemicals, things like that, in upper cabinets or on the counter. If you store them underneath the counter, generally that's fine. I realize that that doesn't exactly meet the language, but usually inspectors, that's how they're gonna look at it. And another thing you need to be or have in place is something like a bottle of bleach or Kinosol or Novosan, whatever it is, that sort of disinfectant. It comes in a gallon jug. You probably should put that gallon jug in a tray in your cabinet, so it's not just sitting on the shelf. So in case there's a leak or a spill, it's still contained. And if you do those things, it's really not a hard thing. And I know it's frustrating to have to go through this, but again, when you look at it, they make sense. I've had cleaning supplies that have busted open and leaked all over the cabinet that they were in. And if I'd had them in a tray that would have contained that spill, sure, it would have been a lot nicer. And, honestly, I still don't have my cleaning supplies sitting in a tray like that, but I probably will now that USDA is going to be coming and looking. That's how it works.
So next one, real simple. You gotta have trash containers in certain places, to take your garbage, and you have to make sure that they minimize odors and control pests. That's relatively simple, but it's just, it's one of those things that it's worth mentioning. You do have to have a trash container. I'm sure we all do, but it's in the rules. And the next one is drainage. So this applies mostly to indoor facilities, but basically you can't have standing water is essentially what this rule says. So if you have a housing facility, it has to be equipped with disposal and drainage facility. So basically, if you have a cement floor, there has to be a drain. The drain has to not be clogged. It has to work, and there's no standing water. The other point in here that I thought was interesting is that, especially for people who are going to set up automatic water systems on indoor facilities, if you have a drip or constant flowing water device, you have basically the water needs to drain relatively quickly and rapidly. And again, this is basically a no standing water rule, which I think again is relatively common sense. You can't have just puddles of standing water that might cause harm to the birds.
Yeah, and I would also add too, because this is basically holdover language from the mammal regs.
Yeah.
Mammals are not typically kept in suspended cages with wire bottoms on. Yeah. I won't say they're never kept that way, but generally they're not. But birds frequently, and probably most often, are kept in elevated cages with a wire bottom. So if a drip or constant flow watering device is dribbling water, it is exiting the cage. But again, common sense comes into play here. If it's draining out to the floor and everything's fine, and you have a dirt floor and it's percolating into the ground, no harm, no foul. But if you have a muddy mess under your cage with uneaten food, getting all wet and gross and bugs coming around, obviously that's a problem. So again, common sense, but don't be, paranoid about a drip or constant flow watering devices, being an issue. They're not if they're used properly.
Yeah, that's a good clarification, Steve. Thank you. This one is what I've heard people complain about. Your facility needs to have a bathroom readily accessible. So from the clarification I've gotten, this doesn't mean there has to be a bathroom on your property, but they have to be able to access a bathroom readily. So what does that mean exactly? I think that's got to be up to your officer to determine. But if you have a facility and your house is next door, that's a readily accessible bathroom. If you have a warehouse and your employees have to go pee at the 7-Eleven, that might be a readily accessible bathroom. I think it's going to be up to your inspector and convincing him. I give the 7-Eleven guy $50 a month to let my employees use the bathroom at the 7-Eleven, maybe. But basically, you have to have a bathroom readily available.
Yep. In most of the cases, right, we're dealing with home hobbyists or small businesses working out of their home. You have a bathroom readily accessible to you at your house.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you have a facility that's away from your home in a warehouse or a vacant lot that just has your bird cages, yeah, there needs to be a washroom available on that facility for whoever's taking care of the birds, you or an employee.
Yeah, which yes. I mean, I think it's problematic if you're the sole caretaker, but they want a bathroom.
It's problematic if it's not, if the facility isn't a home-based facility. A home-based facility is going to have a washroom, I would hope.
Well, Steve, my birds are on an empty lot.
Exactly, right.
And for a long time, I didn't have a bathroom.
Right.
So, I would just, when I had to go to the bathroom, I'd get in my car and I'd go to the gas station down the road. So, I mean, I can see how it can be problematic, but it's relatively simple. You just have to have it readily accessible. So it's one of those things where I think if your inspector makes a problem of it, talk it over with him and see if he'll be lenient about it. So there's a bunch of stuff about indoor facilities, which I just sort of summarized because it's a little long and tedious, but it really just boils down to a couple points. If it's indoor, you basically have to regulate the temperature, humidity, and lighting to be non-detrimental to your birds. So if you have your indoor facility and they walk in and it's 110 degrees, you're probably going to have a problem. If they walk into your facility and it's 100% humidity and you're raising, not seabirds, you're probably going to have a problem. If it turns out that you leave the lights on 24 hours a day, that might also be a problem. But if you keep your indoor facility within a reasonable temperature, a reasonable humidity, and the lights go on and off every day, you're going to be fine. And the facility also needs sufficient ventilation to prevent discomfort and distress of the birds from gas. So from smells, from ammonia, from whatever. The place needs to be sufficiently ventilated. So if you have a concrete bunker with no windows, the lights are always on, and it's 100% humidity, and you've never cleaned it, you have a problem. If you have a facility that's you clean, there's temper regulated, and the lights go on and off, you're most likely going to be fine.
Yeah, and I would add again, if you're keeping birds in a concrete bunker like that, you're probably the type of facility USDA is looking at to make improvements on your care. I mean, let's be honest. The other thing that this brings to mind is we've gotten quite a few questions about, can't these inspections be done, either your attending vet inspecting or the USDA inspector, can they be done remotely by camera? You take your phone, do a live chat with your inspector or your vet, walk around the facility and show them. And the answer to that is no, you can't do that. And this specific slide actually brings up one of the reasons. Things can look fine, but your vet or the inspector, one of the things they're looking for are odors. And you can't get that on a video call. So they want to be there in person specifically for that reason, among others.
Yeah. Moving on to outdoor facilities. The outdoor facility rules are basically a rehash of the cage rules, where you basically have to make the outdoor facilities have to be appropriate for the birds, for the physical conditions, they have to be appropriate for the climate conditions. So obviously, if you're raising parrots in Michigan, you're gonna need to demonstrate that, you either bring the birds inside or have heating. But basically, this is also a very common sense rule. It goes on for a little bit, but basically it's just a relatively common sense rule that you have to house the birds appropriately for the species of bird you have. And so, I mean, anyone who's been doing this long enough knows what is appropriate for the species we have. And, I think no one's gonna have a problem with that. Also, this is in here. I'm not sure why it's in here and not in indoor facilities, but again, this is basically something that we hashed already in the cages. But your cages have to be adequately spaced to prevent aggression between the birds in the cage. They have to be adequate sized and all that. But basically, the outdoor facility rules are basically just rehashing the cage rules, and that's about it. So, Steve, I don't think there's much to say on this one, so I'm going to jump to enrichment, which we have a few things to say about.
Yep.
Enrichment plan. You're going to need to develop an enrichment plan for your birds. And the plan must be approved by the attending veterinarian in accordance with the regulations and currently accepted professional standards cited in appropriate professional journals or reference guides. I think we all know that there's really not much out there guide-wise for bird keeping. There is some things, and I know ASA and AFA have a backlog of a lot of articles. But this is something that I personally would like the OPA and ASA and AFA to work together on, is developing a reference guide where we go talk to every major breeder in the United States and say, how do you do it? We write down what they say, and then we get as many people to give its stamp of approval, and we can say, look, here's our reference guide. We've consulted with all the important bird breeders in the United States. Here's the whole variation of how they do it, and here's your reference guide. And it doesn't only apply to enrichment plan. There's other sections in the regulations where they make a reference to this. So developing a reference guide is going to be important for this going forward. But back to the main thing, you're going to need an enrichment plan. You need to work on it with your vet. Your vet needs to sign off on it, and it needs to be available to the inspectors when they come. So just because they come to the facility and don't see any enrichment doesn't mean you don't have an enrichment plan. They might say, well, I see you don't have any enrichment. And you can say, yeah, but here's my enrichment plan. Tomorrow I gave enrichment yesterday and they already destroyed it. On Friday I give enrichment again, and here's my plan showing you that that's what's going to happen. And that will meet the enrichment plan requirement.
Yeah, regarding enrichment, it's very important because a lot of people hear the word enrichment and they think bird toy. There is so much more that qualifies as enrichment.
Yeah, and Steve,
yeah, here we go. Right.
Yeah, I put up the language.
So yeah, it's social groups, it's dietary, it's everything that goes into the care of the birds or provides the birds with opportunities to do different natural behaviors and things like that. So try to get away from the thought that enrichment is toys. Toys can be part of it, but there's a ton more. And this really isn't difficult to come up with an enrichment plan. If you look at any good care of your birds, any good husbandry, you're going to be providing lots of enrichment. That can be a mate, right? That's part of it. A nest box itself is part of it. A lot of the things we normally do are part of the enrichment that bird has. But we do want to make sure, again, that we have stimulating things so the bird isn't just sitting in the same exact environment 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Put some natural browse in or whatever it is, something to make some changes periodically. And Cody in one of our conversations actually used a phrase that I use often. A bird toy hanging in the cage that's been hanging there for years and the bird ignores that's no longer enrichment anyway. The bird's ignoring it. At that point, it's just cage furniture. So shifting things around a little bit. But as most of us who raise birds understand, when you have a nest box and a mate, the birds often don't pay attention to any other, toys or play opportunities. Some do, not saying across the board. But a lot of times supplying them with a natural mate and the ability to, do a nest and carry out those natural behaviors is probably one of the most enriching things you can provide for your birds.
Yeah, I think Steve covered most of it. So I will highlight, they do require a social enrichment plan to address the social needs of birds known to exist in social groups. I don't know if parents fall into birds needing social groups. I think it'll be interesting to see, but I know I'm just going to go straight away in my enrichment plan and write, my cages are not all blocked from each other, so you can see each other, and that's the social enrichment. And my birds can all hear each other, and that's the social. That's what I'm going to put that. I'm going to put that straight away in my enrichment plan before anyone tells me that do I need to decide are birds social or not, are parents social or not. And like Steve said, basically everything counts as enrichment. They were quite broad with it. So, just I'll give myself as the example, what I'm going to write in my enrichment plan. I give natural wood perches that as they get worn out, I replace. I occasionally give vegetables. And my birds have nest boxes, and the person who feeds is told to, engage with the birds as he walks down the line. And that's gonna be my enrichment plan. I expect that to be sufficient based off what they're telling me I need to put in my enrichment plan. We will see, but I believe that will be sufficient. Natural wood perches, nest boxes, occasional fruits and vegetables, and we speak to the birds as we walk down the line. So one last thing on an enrichment plan that we should highlight is plucked birds. They added this to the rules, from the proposed rules to the new rules. They don't call them plucked birds. So if you go look for plucked birds, you're not going to find it. But the rule says certain birds must be provided special attention regarding enhancement of their environment based on the needs of the individual species or the individual bird in accordance with the instructions of an attending veterinarian. And then they cite a bunch of examples. The one that's really of interest is such as those that show signs of being in psychological distress through behavior or appearance. So if you have plucked birds, your inspector is likely to say, well, show me the individualized enrichment plan for this bird because he's showing psychological distress. And so, here's where you're going to have to make a decision. Am I going to get rid of the plucked birds? Or am I going to do the extra step to keep my plucked birds and say, well, I give them, extra vegetables on Fridays, and I give them an extra toy on, they have an extra toy or something like that. But you will have to give a little additional instruction. Now, it does have to be in accordance with the instructions of the veterinarian. So I do think this does give some leeway to say, well, the bird is plucked and it's been plucked for 20 years. And there's nothing to do about this point. The psychological distress has been addressed, but the bird remains like that. So I think it does give an exempt opportunity to say, well, vet, look at this bird. Can you please say it doesn't need special enrichment because it's just, it's destroyed its follicles at this point.
Yeah, exactly. So we all know probably all have had birds that have had permanently damaged feather follicles. No matter what you do, they cannot grow feathers. They're bald. So be sure to document that. And there's nothing wrong with giving these types of birds, whether they can grow feathers or not, giving them a little extra. That's not a lot to ask, but it is an issue that you need to be aware of. So if you have a large collection and some of the birds are showing the signs of self-damaging behavior, do a little extra for those birds, but also document it that is the condition of that bird. It's been ongoing for many years if that's the case.
Yeah. Water, this is one we probably should have done it earlier, but you have to provide potable water in sufficient quantities. This is a common sense one. They didn't change it from the proposed rule, so basically, you need to give water that's drinkable in sufficient quantities, and you can really only restrict it with discussion with your vet. So it's relatively simple. Give your birds water. Ideally, this is another one where I'm gonna give you my personal opinion. If you can give automatic water, it avoids any issues with dirty water. It avoids, any issues with, oh, I forgot to give I missed a water bowl today. I personally am a big advocate of automatic water. But other than that, there's not much to say at this point.
Yeah, and some of the birds I have don't drink. Why provide them with potable water? But again, it's something that would go in your veterinary care plan. That's acceptable husbandry. Some birds get all of their fluid needs met by a fruit diet, for example. And if that's the case, then just document it. But yeah, I agree with David. I use automatic waters, and when you have a good quantity of birds, then doing that many water bowls, cleaning them regularly is a real pain. So automatic water is the way to go. But if you use water bowls, make sure they're clean and make sure you have protocols in place to make sure they're clean all the time. They can't be sitting there dirty when USDA comes knocking for their unannounced inspection.
Yeah. And the last one, cleaning. The cleaning rule, I don't think I need to go into much detail. We all know what cleaning is. The only thing I would want to highlight here is that you have to have a cleaning schedule, which is probably the thing that's going to change from what we're all used to. If we're all operating our own facilities, we probably don't have a cleaning schedule. We clean as needed. But basically, you're going to have to, come up with a cleaning schedule, and you can modify it or delay it because of breeding. So you could say, if your inspector comes and says, oh, it's a little dirty, you could say, yeah, well, it's breeding season. I haven't cleaned since March. But you also have to be able to say, but I predict breeding season will end in August and I will resume cleaning in September and I will go back to my cleaning schedule. And whatever, and set yourself a reasonable cleaning schedule. If it's every month, month and a half, if that's what you can do, there's no requirement what the cleaning schedule is, but obviously you can't let the garbage and shit and everything pile up. So be realistic with yourself, but also be realistic with, the situation of what your cages look like after how much time. And then, follow your cleaning schedule, and document it, write it on the calendar and say, I cleaned today, because they're going to check that you are following the cleaning schedule.
Yeah, again, common sense applies. And it's important to understand that most of these bird regulations are designed around what's called a performance standard. That means the standards themselves, the specifics, in this case, your cleaning schedule is flexible. Not everybody has to have the same cleaning schedule. If we had engineering standards, for example, it would state cages must be cleaned every day or every week, et cetera, et cetera. It would be a set schedule for everybody. But we're under performance standards. And that means that if your facility is in a clean, acceptable condition, when USDA comes and takes a look, you're meeting that performance standard. Your schedule may be once a month or twice a year, but if your facility is clean and free of odors and pests, and you're only cleaning it twice a year, if that's how you're set up, and everything's fine, then that's fine. That's the benefit of having performance standards and flexibility.
Yeah. Steve, that's basically where my PowerPoint ends. So unless you think I missed something or there's something you want to add, we can switch over to Q&A, but I'll leave it up to your discretion.
Okay. Yeah, no, that was fantastic. And while you were talking, if I looked a little distracted, because I was over answering on the keyboard, a lot of the questions coming in. And there are some unanswered questions right now. So since we're a little bit free form, I'll just go from the top and read them. David says, good evening, and thank you for taking the time to do this for all of us in the community. In regards to shipping transportation, currently USPS, the Postal Service, ships live adult birds, including species that will fall under these regulations. I have read the regulations and I don't see any way possible that they will be able to continue doing so. USPS regulations actually prohibit food and water from being in the boxes, although nobody really follows this rule currently. In addition, transporters would need to physically see the bird, food and water every 4 hours in addition to others. In my opinion, even a USDA licensed shipper like Delta may not be willing to deal with trying to feed water birds and risk them escaping. Any idea on a timeline, et cetera, et cetera. So my thoughts on that, well, the first part is about the Postal Service. So the Postal Service, my understanding is basically like Delta, in that they're a current licensee. Well, the Postal Service is federal government, so I'm not sure about that. But Delta is a current USDA license holder because they ship exotic mammals. And they do have to follow the regulations, and it's no different than it is for birds. The Postal Service, my understanding is, does ship some mammals. I'm not clear on that because I'm not a mammal guy. But commercial shipments, maybe going to pet stores, things like that, of covered animals. And if they do, they're currently following the regulations. But as a federal agency or department, however you want to call that, the U.S. Postal Service, they have fairly strict regulations in place. I don't think there's going to be a conflict unless you get right into the nitty gritty about them prohibiting food and water, you know, and then in the next sentence, everybody tends to put food and water in there anyways. I wouldn't get too excited about it, David. That may not be an acceptable answer to you. But at this point, the shippers, the carriers, they're following these regulations for mammals already. So we're just adding birds to it. I don't know if you have anything to add there, Dave.
No, I mean, I don't have much to add there, just because at the end of the day, this is in the hands of the shippers. And so, yes, you are right. They're already doing this, and whatever changes there are here, you know, at the end of the day, whatever changes there are here, it's not like we have much say over it. It's them who are gonna. It's them who's gonna reach out to Cody and say, we can't do this. We can do this. And it's them who's going to make the business decision. Well, UPS isn't really a business, but it's them who's going to make the decision to whether they want to comply with this or not. And honestly, I don't have much more to say on the point, because, you know, we can roll our tires on it all we want, but at the end of the day, Delta is going to make a business decision, and USPS is going to make, you know, their government decision about whether they're going to continue doing this or not. And so, I don't know if they're going to continue. I really don't. I hope they do, but it's waiting to see how they react. And I'm sure.
David Garcia here. The question is from David also, but different David. David here and I have talked about this before a little bit, exactly in terms of Delta. You know, they're going to make their business decision. USDA has to make their regulations. And if Delta decides that they cannot, it's too much of a hassle, and they're going to get out of the animal shipping business, that's a business decision. That's, you know, there's not much we can do about that. And, you know, of course, we have to put pressure on Delta in particular to keep servicing our needs for shipping our birds. But again, that's parallel, but outside of these regulations. Next question from Alicia. How is enrichment defined? You may have typed that when we were going over that. She says a piece of corn, a branch of eucalyptus. Yeah, so exactly. All of fresh browse, I use fresh eucalyptus branches in my cages regularly. The birds chew them up. Yeah, that's enrichment. A piece of corn, that's enrichment, especially if it's not something the birds get every day. So you throw them a piece of corn every week or two, it's something different. That absolutely qualifies as enrichment. But as we mentioned earlier, a nest box and a mate is enrichment too. Being able to hear the birds across the aisle or in adjacent cages, or even see them, that's all considered enrichment. Technically, my birds are outside, a hawk flies over and they all start screaming at it. That's enrichment. It's an unpredictable event and allows the birds to practice a normal natural behavior that's unpredictable. That's a part of an enrichment program. I have chickens, silky chickens that run underneath my cages. They wander around randomly. There's a few in each building, and it's kind of an unpredictable event to the birds that are above them. Like it or not, that's enrichment. It's something random and unpredictable in their environment that helps break that routine. So enrichment is a very, very broad term.
Yeah, and I mean, so I don't like opening my cages. That's just one of my personal rules. It's just so I don't. For example, what I do is I put leaves on top of the cages. I put branches on top of the cages. That way, I don't have to open the cages. But they'll spend hours, pulling that little leaf through the wire. And so you can, whatever you do. Steve said this before. We all do enrichment. We just don't practice it. We just don't think we're practicing it. And whatever you do, you just have to get into the mindset of, okay, take a week at your farm and think, okay, what did I do today? And write it down. And what did I do Tuesday? And then at the end of the week, look at all the stuff you did and be like, okay, how do I write this log of little things I did into an enrichment plan? And that's basically what you have to do. It's just take that and write it into an enrichment plan.
So on that subject, I'll skip down one. Adrian writes, Steve Martin from NEI can provide information on enrichment for large numbers of birds. He may even have a plan you can use. So that's good. Back up to Debbie says, if we will be exempt because of the de minimis exemption of 200 or under small birds, is there a situation where we may need to prove that we sold X number of birds? We as canary breeders keep hatch records with our breed club registered leg band. We usually make a note of birds sold. Will we have to keep some other proof that we sold X number of birds? Well, yeah, I mean, it's kind of a good, you're sort of having to prove the negative, right? You're not selling 200 or more birds. Well,
yeah,
more than 200 birds.
Steve, if I may jump in on this one.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just to give you the so Steve's right. You have to prove the negative in that situation. Whereas the situation where that's going to come up is someone's going to accuse you, go to the USDA and say, this person is selling more than 200 birds. Or there's the possibility that they'll keep track of you online or something like that. But they're going to come to you and say, well, we think you've sold more than 200 birds. Unless they have proof of that, you're going to be fine. But I'm sure you would be much more comfortable in the situation where they say, well, you sold 201 birds last year. And you can pull out your log and be like, no, I kept my log, and here's my log. It says I sold 195. So do you need to keep it? No. But if you're someone who is on that border, is close to the 200 line, I would recommend you keep a log so that if anyone ever comes and knock, you can say log under 200. So you don't have to, but I would recommend it.
Right. Okay. All right. David writes, also, if we sell smaller birds under the 250 gram weight and decide not to become licensed, will we still be able to ship? Assuming there is a carrier that continues to ship birds. Exactly. So yeah, that's exactly it. So if you're shipping birds going to Delta, for example, how is Delta going to handle that? If you're under the de minimis, is Delta going to believe you and accept that and not, prevent you from shipping your birds? I don't have the answer to that.
But yeah, no, I mean, I think you're still gonna be able to ship them. It's just, you know, like Steve said, it's, if we're still able to ship, but as long as you're under the limit, you can still ship.
Yeah, according to the USDA regulations, yes, you're allowed to. It comes down to Delta's decision.
Yeah.
We all know how difficult
Yeah.
the shippers can be sometimes, so,
And
yeah.
to emphasize, that's if you're shipping pet birds. If you're shipping one exotic, you need a license, so.
Yeah.
Steve, there's a couple questions that came in before that I have
Okay.
here, that if you don't mind,
Go ahead.
I'll take one of these. So she didn't put her name, but they write, are any regulations on interstate travel restrictions, licensing, or details regarding hyacinths or other endangered species? So, no, there's nothing regarding endangered species. There's nothing in particular about that, and it boils down to whether your endangered species is a pet species or not, as we were talking about. But there's nothing about endangered species, nothing about interstate travel or licensing or anything like that. This is about welfare, so they don't care about the species outside of the idea of whether it's pet or non-pet. It's just about welfare. So.
Okay, just before I lose track of this, Magnolia Bird Farm wrote in and I clicked on the wrong button. I was gonna send you a text, but since I clicked on the answer live thing, I can't text answer you. So Magnolia asks, is there any way you could email this PowerPoint later on for review? Yes, and I'm sure David will make that available. If not, I have a full PowerPoint too that I can. But email one of us to remind us, and we'll get that over to you definitely.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm happy to share it, but you know, that PowerPoint was honestly, it's more like it was just on notes for the screen for me and Steve to think about it, talk and think at the same time. We obviously are waiting for Cody to make some changes. I think some things are going to still come out change-wise, and obviously they're still putting out their forms and all that stuff. So the OPA will be putting out a guide, you know, a document to help you, but it probably won't come out for another couple of weeks. And maybe this is a good point to bring up, Steve, what Cody told you, that they're not really accepting applications yet, and so we still have a couple months to wait on things. So I'll happily share it with you, but I would tell you to wait until I get my more formal written up summation, which will come out probably in a couple of weeks once we get a little more, and you'll still be ahead of the ball game because I think, what did he tell you? I think he's not going to accept. They're not really going to accept applications till.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a great reminder, and this is very important. USDA, if you go onto the site and basically download the form to apply for your license, you'll notice it doesn't mention birds on there anywhere. It's all dogs, cats, et cetera, et cetera. So it's going to take them some time to update all that. And he's indicated to me that they probably won't start processing bird new facility applications for 6 months. And the time frame once you apply can be anywhere from about a month to 3 months before you actually get your licensing. And the difference in that time period is how many pre-inspections you need, because there's a pre-inspection available before you get approved for your license. So you'll apply, an inspector will come out, take a look at things, and if he finds a bunch of things you need to correct, you get the opportunity to do that and then get a new pre-inspection. So you can do that 3 times, I think, was what he told me. So 3 months allows for all those pre-inspections. And if you fail, I think all 3 of those, then you have to start the process over and obviously make more significant changes because you've obviously failed. But that's the timeline. So don't rush out right now and start applying, because I know you're all just chomping at the bit to go do that. Give it about 6 months. The information on the forms and on the process will be updated And at that point, which is probably gonna be 6 months from now, that's when you want to start applying for your licenses. The other thing that jogs my memory of is that there is a great FAQ page on the USDA website. I'm sorry I don't have the link to put up on the screen for you, but if you go just to the USDA website and search for Animal Welfare Act regulations for birds, it'll take you right to it. And there's 3 videos on the USDA website that answer a lot of these questions. You have to take the time to watch the videos and go through that. David and I are more than happy to answer your questions as well, but that's a resource that's up there for you 24 hours a day. So it's up there and it's very helpful. So again, a lot of these questions are answered. Not all of them, there's some good ones here, but that's a great resource. Okay, you got anything to add to that, David, or I'll go on to the next question?
No, let's go on to the next question.
Okay, let's see here. We have Adrian says, and addressing Suzanne, maybe a lot of emails asking why that number and for it to be raised. I think that was in reference to 8 birds over 250 grams. And yes, I have mentioned this to Cody and pushed on that in our direct conversations. And, you know, 8 birds over 250 grams is not very many. And again, these are just for pet birds. If it's an exotic bird, you don't even get the 8. This is how that works. So yeah, I would like to see that number in particular. I also mentioned to Cody today, and David and I talked about this, on the other side, you have a limit of 200 small birds. And in my last conversation with Cody, I explained to him that, for example, there are lots of zebra finch breeders that breed for show. And they may raise hundreds of birds and select just the best birds they're going to go to show. The rest of those birds are typically sold to the local pet store, Magnolia Bird Farm, or whoever else. And those being wholesale transactions, then they're going to be over that 200 bird limit. And these are very small birds, not very much money, but there are a lot of people that fit that. So yeah, where did that 250 gram cutoff come from? Well, USDA looked into it and made that it's a little bit arbitrary. It's not bad, but again, on the extreme ends of that, it doesn't quite work. But we could break this down into 100 gram increments, right? And then it gets more and more complicated. So I'm not sure how to improve it, other than I would like to see those 200/8 levels increased, of course. I think that would be in everybody's best interest. I also, on this subject, did tell Cody that I think there's a lot more people than he realizes, or USDA in general realizes, are going to be subject to licensing the way the regulations are written. The numbers are bigger than they realize. And I think that's going to come as a surprise to them. But there's not a lot we can do about it at this point, other than keep pushing on that.
Yeah, no, and I mean, that was my gut too, when I saw the pet rule, because I said, well, now they're going to regulate everyone, because if they leave out a lot, the original rule left out ringnecks and Quaker parrots, which is basically everyone. So
yeah,
but well, we'll see. I was very surprised by the de minimis, how high it went. And I'm skeptical they're going to move it from that. But you know, let's see if there's any movement on that.
Okay, so Cliff writes, this question was posted: if we are below the de minimis and exempt from licensure, is a health certificate required for shipping unwinged birds? If so, that would not really mean we are exempt. Well, yeah, if you're below the de minimis, the health certificate is what states generally require. Some airlines always require them. I think Alaska Air, I forget. they always require them. But that's outside of what USDA is saying. USDA is saying for the shipping of unweaned birds. And primarily, that's going to be birds classified as pets. So it's going to be that 200 versus 8 levels there. So Cliff also says, my question is, shipping period makes you not exempt and requires licensing. Well, that's where that pet bird, exotic bird distinction comes in. So you may or may not be exempt for shipping fewer numbers.
And sorry, Steve, but I think Cliff is saying a slightly different thing. I think he's complaining that we're going to need health certificates, even if you are a de minimis shipper. And yes, Cliff, you will. If you are a de minimis, if you fall into the de minimis exemption and you ship birds, you will still need the health certificate, but that's not because it's required of you. The rule is specifically written to require it of the carrier. So Delta will be a licensed USDA, will be licensed under USDA as a carrier. And so if you want to use Delta, Delta needs to comply with their requirements as a USDA licensee, and that's going to be asking you for a health certificate. So you're not licensed, but you're being affected by that part of the licensing provision, because anyone who is in that in that business of shipping animals will need to comply with the USDA requirements.
Yeah, exactly. And put yourself in Delta's position, right? So you've got people bringing you in birds, and they know that to be in compliance with the regulations, they need this documentation. And so, fine, you're under the de minimis, but Delta isn't, first of all, and they're not going to risk it on your behalf. To be honest with you, I wouldn't. So it's likely they're going to always require those certificates. Yeah. So I hope that makes sense. I don't think I explained it quite well from the start.
Steve, there's another question that came in earlier that I want to address. They asked, as a retailer in New York, the ban on shipping unweaned birds is catastrophic. If the regulation is allowed to stand, could I buy birds in Florida and then drive them to New York? So as we already talked about, it seems like they're walking back the ban on unweaned birds. But regardless of what the final rule says, it goes back to what I was saying to Cliff. The ban is on transport companies. So they call them carriers and intermediate handlers, but that's transport companies. It's not actually on us. So yes, if you own a bird store and you want to buy birds in Florida and you don't want to deal with health certificates or like that, you can drive down to Florida and pick up the birds unweaned and drive them back to your business. And you'll be able to do that in all situations. And likewise, you should be able to hire an employee and say, okay, take my birds or pick up these birds unweaned and drive them back to me. Because it's only on carriers and intermediate handlers, and those are defined as basically companies who primarily deal with shipping. So you will be able to move unweaned birds as long as you're not an intermediate carrier or handler without having to do meet any of these requirements.
Okay. Fred writes, when will we need to file for licenses? So we just covered that, probably 6 months. And you have pre-license inspections that happen relatively quickly after you apply. Once you pass your pre-license inspection and become licensed, the license are what, 3 years, 2 years? I forget now.
3 years.
3 years, okay, yeah. So 3 years, but you're going to be subject probably to annual inspections, even though your license is good for 3 years.
The licensing fee, I don't know it off the top of my head, Steve. Do you know? I think it's like $100.
Yeah, I don't think it's a huge amount. Yeah, that's reasonable, actually. Okay, Cliff writes, how are bird marts exempt? That is face-to-face. However, it falls into the same non-exemption of meeting in a parking lot is not a residence or place of business. Not okay, not exempt. Well, I think you have to look at it as a temporary place of business. So the transactions are face to face, but at the bird mart, that is the place of business. It's only there for that day, but that's how that works. So
Yeah.
Andrea writes, how do you think these regulations will affect our ability to buy and sell medications for birds without vet prescriptions? Well, honestly, I don't think it will make a difference. I'll see if David has a different take on that. But as far as that directly, I don't think it will make a difference. I do believe, though, that USDA is going to be looking for, if you're a big facility with hundreds and hundreds of birds, you're going to have problems at some point along the line throughout the year where birds are going to need some sort of veterinary care. And I think USDA, that might be some of the things they're going to be looking for. What were your veterinary access events for this period of time? And you're probably going to want to document that. So if you're getting medications for a sick bird, something you might want to document through your vet, and I understand the motivation there, but it's just something to think about. But directly, no, I don't think it will affect your ability to buy it without a vet prescription if that's the way you do it now.
I have my concerns about the question because Steve, that I've seen everything, but the way a lot of people get meds now is not legal. So, if you're buying medications that require a prescription without a prescription, just because you're getting it doesn't mean that it's legal. I mean, right. You might be ordering it accidentally from a foreign country and they're sending it to you, like that. Buying fish meds and using them off label for birds is also not technically legal. All these things that people do to get medications, fluconazole, Baytril, metronidazole, all the antibiotics that are commonly used, doxycycline, all that stuff, you can't get without a prescription. Period. That's applies now. That we get it without a prescription is a different story, but we can't get it without a prescription. The only things that you can get without a prescription are the certain farm meds that they sell over the counter at your feed store. So like Tylenol, oxytetracycline, but those aren't really things that get used in parrots anyway. But regardless, whether you're getting something from the feed store or you're getting, fluconazole, metronidazole, whatever, you're gonna need a prescription. You're gonna need a prescription for your vet to use it. So you can't just have the good old days of having a gallon of Baytril under the counter and saying, "Oh, the bird doesn't look good, give him Baytril," are kind of over. You're gonna need to say, like, "Hey vet, I got a bird that doesn't look right. I'm gonna give him Baytril. Is that okay?" And the vet's gonna have to say yes, and I'll send you, a note or whatever. How exactly you want to do that, or you're gonna have to figure it out with your vet and what USDA accepts, your inspector accepts. But basically, there's going to be a situation where your vet can say, "Okay, I'll give you 100 pills of Cipro," but to use it, if the inspector comes and sees a row of birds with water bottles that are marked Cipro, he's going to say, "Okay, well, show me where the vet told you the dosage and the timing and okay, you giving Cipro for this." So, in conclusion, you're probably not getting your prescriptions legally as it is if you're not getting a vet prescription. And going forward, you're still going to be able to get prescriptions. I mean, you can now get all your meds through Chewy. All you have to do is call up your vet and say, "Hey, I need Metro," and you can order it on Chewy, and they'll send, and your vet can approve it online, and your Metro comes in the mail. So in reality, now that we all have to have vets, it should be easier for us to get them legally. Since we'll all have someone we can call and say, "Hey, I got this problem and I think I need this. Will you send me a script?" And then you can order it on Amazon MD or Chewy or wherever, or Value Vet, whatever you want. So that's my conclusion. You were probably doing something illegal, and the regulations will probably now help you do it legally.
Excellent clarification. Thank you. Okay, Adrian writes, I heard that USDA is ending teachable moments. Will that affect how new applicants are treated since they may have no prior experience with this? So I don't know. I know USDA has been using teachable moments. And I hadn't heard they were ending it. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But I think in answer to your question, you kind of have to follow along with the pre-license inspections that I mentioned earlier anyway. And there is a license application assistant thing on the USDA website that kind of walk you through it. So you're going to learn what's required, but really you have those pre-license inspections where you're given the opportunity to learn. You know, it's basically the same thing as I see it as a teachable moment. They're going to give you those options to correct it before the next pre-license inspection. So I think that answers your question. All right, Cliff writes, pre-application task force was an idea I floated by David. The idea being some of us helping by paying visits in our states to others before we actually do apply, where our fellow agriculturists to help us to get into full compliance before we even apply. Yeah, it's a great idea. We can come up with the people who are experienced with it. Of course, kind of we're all new at this too, and we're all figuring it out. But yeah, that's a great potential suggestion there. Once we kind of get a handle on the regulations and walk through it ourselves, absolutely. I'm always happy to help people, always. So certainly I would, be available for that, even remotely, if not in person to my local people. Anything you got there, David?
Yeah, no, I mean, I've offered my service to the larger facilities, that they can hire me if they want me to come out and walk the facility with them and have a detailed pre-inspection review. And likewise, I mean, this is a good segue, we're talking about what the rules actually say and what the USDA has told us. This is a big country. There's a lot of inspectors. They aren't all going to be smart. So, if your inspector when your inspectors come out and they might be telling you something that isn't in the rules, push back on them. And obviously I'm here for anyone who needs help with that as well. But I do think, they are willing to do pre-inspections, and that's going to give you quite a bit of opportunity. So unless there's something major or real concerns, or I think it should be okay.
All right, Richard writes, another thought regarding shipping with Delta. Right now, we avoid temperature restrictions by declaring that our shipments do not contain pet birds. If this defines our animals as pets, I'm afraid that is going to cause a problem with that process. That's a great observation, but I'll reframe it. But this is exactly the kind of language that can have unintended consequences if it's misinterpreted. So Delta right now does not have an issue, or doesn't enforce those temperature restrictions for commercial shipments. So you can have commercial shipments of pet birds. It's when you're shipping a pet bird from your pet household, for example, to another pet household. This is essentially a bird that's been kept in somebody's living room, and it's used to the cushy life. It's not going to be as robust, I guess, theoretically, and not be able to handle those temperature restrictions, whereas commercial shipments, which often contain more than one bird too, to help keep each other warm, I guess. But it is that distinction. It really has nothing to do with the pet bird classification. It's whether or not, you can ship a cockatiel that would be subject to the pet bird restriction from Delta, but you can ship a shipment of cockatiels that's a commercial shipment and therefore not subject to those temperature restrictions.
Yeah, and I think Steve, everything Steve said is right. I just I just think considering the Delta stuff is sort of spinning our wheels because it's a business decision,
Right.
and at the end of the day, they're going to decide what's best for business.
Right.
And there's no complaining to Delta. Oh, your new requirements are unfair. Delta's a business. It's not the federal government. So if Delta says, fine, we're going to keep shipping birds, but now you have to do all this extra nonsense, there's not much we can do about it except comply or don't ship. So it's one of those things, you know. What we should do about Delta is wait and see.
Right. Right. All right. Cliff also writes, if you're not licensed, I read it as no sales to retail pet stores in any quantity. No, the sales to pet stores, if you're selling pet birds, are subject to that 200 small bird or 8 bird large bird restriction. But anytime you're selling to a pet store, that is a wholesale transaction. So you are subject to those 200/8 de minimis levels. So yeah, as soon as you sell them, you know, 9 macaws, you technically would need to be licensed, even if they don't, because you're a wholesale dealer at that point.
Yeah.
All right, Juan writes, I wonder how they're going to target a broker that doesn't leg band their birds and wholesale them. Any thoughts?
So
yeah, go ahead, David.
The leg banding rule, it's the same for brokers as it is for breeders. You don't necessarily have to leg band. It's one of my hobby horses. I think everybody should leg band their birds. I think it's for the best, but the brokers don't have to leg band their birds either. They can also go with placards and say this shipment contains 30 Pirura Malinae, you know, and that's it. The rules are a little bit different. They have to put a little bit more, but basically, you know, they can have the same thing. So they have to keep records, and their records are going to be raw numbers, you know, saying 30, you know, I sold 500 green cheeks in the month of January, and you know, it's going to be broken down by day and whatever, and purchaser. But there's no, you know, they're not required to leg band, and yeah, it's a loophole that you know, people are gonna drive a bus through probably, but you know, it is what it is.
All right, Cliff also writes, shipping though is not a face-to-face sale. Exactly, that's right.
Yeah.
So even if you're selling to the consumer, that's not, you don't have the retail pet exemption. So yeah. But you are subject to the de minimis levels, 200 small birds, 8 large birds.
Yeah, and maybe,
more than that.
Steve, maybe we say it like this, it'll come clear. You can ship up to 200 small birds and up to 8 large birds without needing a USDA license. Or you can sell everything you want in face-to-face transactions. Those are your options. You can either ship under 200 or sell 500, but they're all face-to-face.
Right. And those only apply to birds categorized as pet birds.
Yeah.
Right. So if it's not a pet bird, it's an exotic bird, there is no de minimis. As soon as you sell them, you have to be licensed.
Yeah.
Cher just wanted to say thank you for all your tireless work. Have to leave the group. All right, Cher, thanks for joining us. Cliff, not health certificate to ship, but USDA license to ship. Okay, so I'll take a crack at that. The USDA license to ship, well, there's a number of different facets of this. Delta has to be licensed as a carrier of regulated animals. So they have a USDA license to ship. I, as a breeder, have to be licensed because I'm selling more than the de minimis levels. I'll be licensed as a breeder. The health certificate thing, I want to be clear on this. A health certificate is different than the certificate required to ship unweaned birds. The shipping of unweaned birds is the thing that needs to have a certificate signed within 10 days by your vet. Health certificates are required by certain airlines in certain states, so many of us get health certificates already. Has nothing to do with the Animal Welfare Act. Now, David, I might be unclear on health certificates also being required for animal welfare. I don't think there's a requirement for general health certificates, say, for example, for adult birds.
No, so,
Yeah.
so, and we've been using the health certificate because that's sort of the idea that we thought maybe was coming, but from what Cody has told me, what's coming is not a health certificate.
Right.
It's basically going back to the proposed rule, which is shipping instructions from your vet. The only difference is that your shipping instructions will have to be signed within 10 days of shipment. So it's taking the health certificate requirement of signing, before within a certain amount of time, but it's just shipping instructions that need to be signed by the vet. So
Okay, looks like we're down to the last two on this list. Fred says, will there be a basic USDA vet form? Who will be accepted as a veterinarian to complete our vet plan, as it is already hard to get a vet to come out, a horse vet or a vet assistant? Yeah, so that is an issue, but the rules are that you can have any licensed vet. Your attending vet doesn't even have to be licensed in your state. You can use any licensed vet to be your attending vet, but you do have to have a veterinarian come out, which is typically your attending vet. But if your attending vet is out of state, you could have a veterinarian license in your state come out and do that inspection and work with your attending vet who's out of state, right? So now you've got two vets involved, but that is an option. Any veterinary care provided to your animals has to come from a licensed vet in your state. That's rules already, it has nothing to do with USDA. So I think that covers it. Yes, a horse vet, or not a vet assistant.
a vet assistant
Be a licensed vet.
Yeah.
All righty, a couple more coming in, so let's see if we can chase them down before we run out of time here. What about a foreign vet who prescribes meds? No, it's as far as a foreign vet prescribing meds, I don't think that meets the normal veterinary rules for prescriptions. Yeah, David.
Yeah, I don't know the exact FDA rules about that, and there is some weird loophole about it, but it's not good. It's most likely not going to be okay. Usually,
so yeah, you could go to a foreign country and legally acquire medicine
and bring them back.
But the dosage and applying them to your birds, because that's here in this country, I don't think that's legal.
Yeah, and usually, and all these rules usually require, like, yes, with COVID, we got a lot really into telemedicine, but they're walking most of those rules back, and you basically, the vet needs to be able to see the animal, and a foreign licensed vet is going to have a foreign license. Alicia, it's not a good idea. It's not going to work. It's not recommended.
Okay, David writes, not to beat a dead horse, but want to make sure I understand. Can I ship 200 small birds and in addition sell 100 face-to-face on my property and still avoid the licensing requirement? That's easy. Yes.
Yeah.
David, and do bird fairs count towards the 200 total? Bird fair, bird mart, that's a retail face-to-face transaction. So you have the retail exemption as long as it's a pet bird, classified bird that you're selling. As you start selling an exotic bird, whatever those end up being, then you have to be licensed. Again, I try to make the parallel between existing mammal regulations. Hamsters, guinea pigs, etc. You don't need a license retail, but sugar gliders, hedgehogs, you need a license for any of them. So the birds, it's the same way. Lastly, right now, Magnolia Bird Farm says, thank you, Steve and David, so much for offering this Q&A and all that good stuff. Well, you're very welcome, Magnolia Bird Farm. We're happy to do it, and as always, email either one of us. We're happy to answer your questions at any time. And don't forget to go to the USDA website. I sound like I'm plugging them, but really, I want this to work. And if people understand the regulations, not that I'm promoting them, I'd rather not do this.
Steve, if you're sponsored, you have to tell us.
It's better if it runs smoothly and we need to understand it. So the USDA website itself is a great resource. All right, so thank you everybody for coming. I don't have anything to add. Do you have anything, David?
No, just that we are fundraising because we do want to put together a guide, a reference guide, which is going to cost us some money. Obviously, we're still putting a lot of lobbying efforts into this. We would appreciate if you could donate. Our goal is $50,000 for help with our efforts in relation to the USDA. Obviously, there's still a lot that could happen here. Like I said, the litigation is still ongoing, so we don't know what the Avian Welfare Coalition might do, which could screw up a lot of this. I mean, that it's not. I don't think it's super likely, but in the back of my head, I won't be happy until the case is closed. So, you know, we would really appreciate it if you could donate. Like I said, we're trying to raise $50,000, you know, to fund everything, and that's going to go towards basically work we're doing in relation to this, including hopefully putting together a reference guide in the next couple of months that we can publish, and that will basically be, I mean, if we do it, when we do it, it'll basically be, if you do these things, you will be fine with the USDA guide. So we would appreciate if you could donate and support all the work we're doing.
Yeah, so in order to donate, go to the OPA, Organization of Professional Agriculturists website, opabirds.org, and you'll find the donate button there. And I also want to make it clear that David and I do all this stuff. We're not making a salary. We don't get paid anything to do this. We are 100% volunteers, and we're happy to do it. And I'm not asking for, you know, any sort of reimbursement or pay for what I do, but I will ask you to support our efforts by going to the website and donating to us, because not everything we do is volunteer hours that David and I and the rest of our board puts in. There are actual costs. There's court filing costs. There's, you know, office costs. There is actual hard costs for doing this work, and we'd love to have your support for that. As I said, David and I, and the rest of the board, and it's not just OPA, it's ASA, it's AFA, we're all pitching in for free. It's volunteer work, but we do need the support for those things that actually cost our organizations money in order to protect our community of aviculture. So yeah, please do go to opabirds.org and click on that donate button, and let's build up at least a functional war chest so we can offset some of those costs.
Yeah.
All right, great. Thank you again, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, take care. We'll see you next time.
Yeah.